And we're recording. So welcome everybody. My name is Kyle Scholey and I work with Smoky Lake County. I'm joined by my boss, Jordan Rugg, Smoky Lake County, as well as three fantastic panelists, Thomas Long, Senator Paula Simons, and Billie Milholland as well. And so the reason we're all here this evening, of course, is to have a conversation basically about Smoky Lake County's project to designate the North Saskatchewan River as a Canadian Heritage River. And so to that end, we've got a brief presentation. I'll maybe just actually start sharing my screen right now. Okay, that appears to be working. Excellent. Welcome once again. I want to start by acknowledging that we are gathered electronically this evening. Jordan and myself from Smoky Lake, which is situated on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis Nation. And thank you for choosing to spend a few minutes with us this evening on your Wednesday evening. I kind of got ahead of myself a little bit here. So the program for this evening is to give a short presentation from Jordan and myself. That'll be followed by perhaps a little bit of storytelling from each of our panelists, each of our guests. And then we'll kind of open up into an opportunity for questions and answers. And that's actually the portion I'm most looking forward to. I don't think anybody wants to listen to Jordan and I drone on too long, so we'll try to keep that relatively short and go from there. Just refer to my notes here. Okay, so and as we're going through the presentation, basically, if questions are coming up, please make sure that you are putting them into the Q&A. And then when we get to that portion, we'll be delving into those and hopefully shedding a little bit of light on what's going on. So with that, I will turn it over to Jordan.
Thank you, Kyle. And I think you need to bring up the actual slide presentation there, because at least what I'm seeing is your desktop. So
that's not very helpful. I wish I'm
not sure if that's what everyone else is seeing, but we'll let you get that set up. So as Kyle mentioned, my name's Jordan Rugg. I'm the Planning and Development Manager here for Smoky Lake County. Really excited to have everyone here with us this evening. So thank you for your time, and hopefully we make it worthwhile. Kyle is going to bring up the presentation, I believe, but I'll give a little bit of an introduction about where we are here in Smoky Lake County, for those of you who aren't aware. We're located about 120 kilometers northeast of the city of Edmonton. There we are. And as Kyle likes to indicate, it's about a 2-day canoe ride from Edmonton. So we highly recommend everyone trying that out. We're very happy to have some significant partnerships, specifically with the Métis Nation of Alberta through their development at Métis Crossing, as well as the provincial government through their historic site at the Victoria District, which is a beautiful place to visit. A little bit about the county itself. We like to consider ourselves as a community that recognizes the importance of enhancing its character and the roots from which it grew. And also we believe that we're a caring community, which offers our residents a wide variety of environmental and housing opportunities, employment opportunities, education, cultural activities, and really sort of forms the basis of who we are as a community. And we believe that the Canadian Heritage River System designation is something that sort of aligns with the goals of our community and our community vision. Where we are in terms of the physical geography and specific to the water basins, we are, as no surprise, I'm sure to everyone, part of the North Saskatchewan River Basin. And more specifically, we're located within the White Earth watershed, and you can see Smoky Lake County is included on that map there. I'll turn it back over to Kyle to give us a little bit of a backgrounder on Alberta and the North Saskatchewan River.
I don't know how many months into COVID it'll have to be before I learn to unmute. Maybe one or two more. So basically, we have the advantage of being on the North Saskatchewan River. And when we say North Saskatchewan, most people know where that is. It's certainly the North Saskatchewan is one of the great rivers of Alberta and certainly Western Canada. And so our relationship with the North Saskatchewan River is substantial. We all know that it starts in our beautiful Canadian Rocky Mountains and flows all the way across Alberta, Saskatchewan, into Manitoba, and eventually into Hudson Bay. So certainly it connects many, many communities and is greatly significant in the background of Western Canadian heritage. So I also want to talk a little bit about why Smoky Lake County has chosen to take up this project to designate the North Saskatchewan River, because there are some very precise reasons why we're doing so. Primarily, Smoky Lake County has embarked on an economic development strategy in partnership with the town of Smoky Lake and the Métis Nation of Alberta. And so the aim of that strategy essentially is to encourage and support development of tourism assets across the county, across the region. Certainly that plugs in very cleanly with Travel Alberta's plan to double tourism in Alberta. And certainly we see our role as encouraging land and water and nature-based, heritage-based, cultural-based, culinary tourism as being the primary drivers of that. So we're really excited about that work that's ongoing. And so number one, this kind of comes out of that initiative. We're not here to sterilize the river corridor or make it closed off from people. Quite the opposite. North Saskatchewan is an undervalued resource, perhaps, that is deserving of more recreation, but smart recreation as well. Number two, this initiative has kind of so far been an opportunity to renew relations among communities along the river. Certainly, there's no getting around it. The North Saskatchewan joins us. The river also doesn't care about things like municipal boundaries. It flows where it wants to go. And so certainly, be it municipal communities, First Nations and Indigenous communities, that's another opportunity that comes out of this project. And then lastly as well, stewardship. And so basically stewardship is a feel-good word, and I don't really like it. But what I mean by that is that people care about the things that they see. Basically, if we are to have a renewed relationship with the North Saskatchewan, I believe, and I think evidence proves this out, that people will make smarter decisions at an individual level. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as the presentation kind of rolls forward. I will turn it back over to Jordan to talk briefly about what a heritage river is.
Thank you, Kyle. So currently the Canadian Heritage River System comprises of approximately 40 heritage rivers, which are recognized nationally for their outstanding natural, cultural, and recreational heritage. And these rivers form an important part of Canada's rich heritage and help shape who we are as a nation. The designated rivers are part of a larger network of waterways that are cared for by passionate local river stewards. So despite this being a federal program, federal designation, it's actually the local stewardship groups and communities that sort of form the backbone of how this program works, and also how some of these stewardship efforts are implemented. Governments, local communities, conservation authorities, and local citizens all come together as part of this program with the overarching goal of celebrating and conserving and protecting these designated rivers. And as Kyle was mentioning before, we think that this type of designation really suits sort of what the county is doing in terms of its economic development strategy, in terms of promoting heritage and cultural activities in the area, as well as the recreational opportunities as well. So I'll turn it back to Kyle to give you a little bit of background information on the Canadian Heritage River Systems Charter, and there it is right there.
Yeah, thank you. And so, something that's come up in our conversation so far with folks across the province basically is trying to understand what is CHRS, what are Canadian Heritage Rivers, and kind of who runs the show, how is it structured, how does it work. At its very fundamental, the charter, I guess, basically outlines the purpose, the vision, the goals, as supplemented by a few other documents, which you also see on your screen, as a partnership between the federal government, the provincial governments, and local communities. Basically, there's a few key takeaways. That number one, participation is voluntary. Nobody's forced to participate or to be under the auspices of the program. Number two, it's honorary. So that means basically that this is not an additional layer of red tape. It's not legislative. It's not regulatory. It is honorary and commemorative. So basically what that means is that, there are no rules that are brought about as a result of the designation. Certainly ownership and jurisdiction are unaffected by the designation. So, the sun rises the following day and everything is still very much the same as it was the day before. However, it's kind of, again, honorary is a good word because I guess the example that I can draw on is that, again, when people see the things around them, they care more. And so when we look, for example, at the Ottawa River in Ontario that has previously been designated, and they had quite a lengthy journey to achieve that designation as well. There was no additional, there has been and was not any additional enforcement that has occurred because of this designation. However, at the same time, folks have taken steps to limit, for example, the amount of septic that's leaching into the river, for example, and that trends very consistently with the process to achieve that designation. And so, I mean, it's perhaps coincidental that because people are caring more, they're willing to make better decisions as individuals and not with, necessarily parks enforcement cruising the river and handing out tickets. So I think that's really important to point out as well. The other piece that I would comment on is that the Heritage Rivers Board, which is kind of the governing structure of the program, is made up of representatives from the participating jurisdictions. So the territories, federal government, the provinces minus Quebec, sit as a board, and each jurisdiction remains responsible for their rivers, right? So this is not about a park boundary being extended across the river, across the province. Local authorities remain in control, and so I think that's really important to point out as well. So there have been examples, as Jordan pointed out, where the Heritage River program has existed basically now for 40 years, and there's been 40 designations pretty much under the program. It's quite a successful program. And so for a lot of those reasons, again, it's got a very good Alberta attitude, that it's not about policing folks, but it's about providing information and education. So, but I'm getting into kind of some of the goals, and I'll turn that back over to Jordan to talk about.
Thank you, Kyle. So the CHRS has a number of goals that sort of flow from the charter, and the pun is entirely intended there. And some of these goals include the fostering cooperative river management that unites communities behind a common goal, a celebration and promotion of the cultural connections that Indigenous peoples have with rivers in Canada. It's a storytelling exercise, stories of our nation, and building a sense of identity and pride as who we are as a people. A goal is to stimulate adventure travel and sustainable tourism. We have a lot of people that like to use the rivers, and having that sort of cultural and historic component to it, enhances those experiences. And also to help Canadians connect to history, nature, and cultural traditions, promote stewardship and citizen engagement, engaging new Canadians and youth in river education, conservation, and recreation initiatives, as well as to encourage the protection of water resources and to improve public health, well-being, and quality of life. One of the other fascinating components of the CHRS system, if Kyle will skip ahead here, are the story maps. And these story maps highlight the natural, cultural, and recreational values of each of Canada's heritage rivers by telling a story. So giving us a little bit of the historical context. And as Kyle's indicated on his slide here, he believes, and I agree with him, that we've identified a major gap. If you look at where these little black markers are, those are all stories that have been told. And we believe that there's an opportunity here to tell a story about the North Saskatchewan River, and it's a fascinating story, and it spans a lot of history, brings in a lot of different Indigenous peoples and cultures, and we believe that that this gap can be addressed through this designation. We highly encourage everyone to check it out. Unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of time to look at it this evening, but if you go to the website, www.chrs.ca, you can find some fascinating stories about these rivers. I'm from Vancouver originally, and I didn't realize until Kyle got me onto this program that the Fraser River, which I lived right next to for 30 years, is designated as part of this program. You'd never know it. There's development everywhere. But I learned a lot, and I think everyone else can too. I'll turn it back over to Kyle for a little bit more information about why the North Saskatchewan should be designated as a Canadian Heritage River.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, as we kind of mentioned earlier, the North Saskatchewan is known by a lot of folks, and for a lot of reasons. So number one, it's stunning to look at. The landscape, the deep river valley, the fluvial formations, and I just love the word fluvial, so I want to say it whenever I get the chance. So in the 90s, so let me back up. CHRS was founded in the 80s, and initially Alberta did not join. However, later under Premier Ralph Klein in the 90s, a series of studies were commissioned, and Alberta ended up joining in 1996, if I'm not mistaken, under Premier Klein again. And those studies identified a series of rivers across the province which ranked highly against the Heritage Rivers framework for recreational, cultural, and natural values. The North Saskatchewan certainly is in that top 10 list of kind of AA prime candidate rivers which are deserving of recognition and celebration. So basically, again, it all comes back to those three values: natural, cultural, and recreational. Certainly the portion of the North Saskatchewan within the lands of Banff National Park, there's about 50 kilometers of North Saskatchewan within the park, which were designated actually already in the 80s, because again, those were federal lands, and so that's a federal decision. But the remaining river across the province, being provincial, hasn't yet been designated, even though it carries with it substantial human heritage, substantial cultural, recreational values, especially. And so the river represents very well all three of those themes. It's especially strong on the cultural side, and our panelists, I think, are going to talk a little bit more about that this evening. And that brings us to kind of what our proposal is to do, which is to designate that portion in Alberta that remains undesignated at this time. So from the Banff Park boundary all the way through to the Saskatchewan boundary. So that represents about 818 or so kilometers of river. There's stories and significant sites all along that reach of river. And certainly we're very hopeful that because the province of Alberta has committed to carrying this forward under Minister Nixon, that others will also follow suit, and that we could see a situation soon where the entire river from the mountains to Lake Winnipeg are recognized under the program. That kind of brings me to a point that I meant to mention earlier, in that designation is kind of arbitrary, isn't it? So all rivers and bodies of water in Canada do have heritage significance, right? And so I think it's important that we recognize that. And so the program in its documents actually acknowledges that, number one, designations are kind of arbitrary, but then number two, that everywhere is significant as well. That kind of also brings us to this subject of how does a designation process work? So before a river can be designated, basically there has to be done a background study that looks at the cultural values framework under CHRS, as well as natural values framework. And that background study is a deep dive. And so basically we're very lucky to be joined by Billie Milholland this evening, because she was a big part, she was a driving mega force behind authoring actually a background study for the North Saskatchewan in the mid-2000s. And so that background study, checked that box very wholeheartedly that yes, the North Saskatchewan, there's a lot of reasons to be proud of it and to cherish it and to share it both with Albertans, Canadians, and visitors from further afield as well. Subsequent to being identified as a candidate through a background study, and this is where we are now, a nomination document basically, which distills all of the really great information in that comprehensive background study into a slightly briefer, firmer document as to why the river is specifically substantial. If once that nomination document gets accepted by the Heritage Rivers Board, that document, we're working on that document now and gets submitted through Alberta Environment to the Heritage Rivers Board. Once that's accepted, the river is considered to be nominated. Subsequently, a designation document, and it's also called a management plan. And so as we've been talking about, a management plan is non-statutory, so it doesn't carry any legislative weight. It doesn't really affect anybody's lives very much, so far as to just kind of describe the ongoing work that's being done to safeguard the values, the integrity values of the natural, cultural, and recreational themes. So it's not a very scary document. It's very benevolent, and it's just really more of a resource than anything. But that's the final step. The designation document gets accepted by the Heritage Rivers Board and goes to the Federal Minister of Environment for final autograph to finally say, yes, congratulations, the river is designated and considered to be having Canadian significance. So with that, I'll just turn it back to Jordan to answer a few rapid fire Q&A questions.
Thank you, Kyle. So during our whirlwind interprovincial tour that Kyle and I have been on, where we've spoke to a number of different municipal councils and stakeholder groups, we've received a lot of questions, and we wanted to focus just on two of them today that seem to be popping up everywhere before certainly allowing everyone their opportunity to have question time at the end. The first is does the designation as a Canadian Heritage River restrict development? And the short answer is no. The CHRS is strictly commemorative. The designation does not carry any planning or development authority with it. So as Kyle just mentioned, it's not a statutory document, commemorative in nature only. It doesn't affect any municipal or provincial land use policies. There's no added referrals or considerations. And the jurisdiction and the ownership of the river and the riparian areas, the banks itself, does not change. So the value of the designation is in the public education component, where the honoring of the water and the landscape. It's not meant as a way of restricting any type of development or anything of that nature. So no, we hope to sort of quash that rumor and assuage any fears that people have that if this designation is to proceed, that they won't be able to, to develop around the river or enjoy it in the ways that they're currently using. And the second question that we've been receiving quite a lot lately is, do we want to rename the North Saskatchewan River? And this is definitively no. The North Saskatchewan River will remain named as such. It's very important to us that we wanted to make sure that people understood that this isn't our effort to try to erase history and rename the North Saskatchewan to something that it's not. We believe that this designation would actually strengthen that name. And Kyle has also included some translation here. Saskatchewan is derived from, and I'm not going to be able to say this, Kisaskasuwani Sipi, and I apologize, which means swift flowing. So thank you to Kyle for putting me on the spot for that. But we are not intending to rename the North Saskatchewan River. So
perfect. Yeah, thanks for that, Jordan. Post designation. Oops, I skipped forward. Post designation. Again, we're at Smoky Lake County looking to use this as a vehicle to encourage visitation. I think we all know that our mountain parks are overflowing with people, and tourism doesn't and shouldn't begin and end at the national parks. Certainly, there's a lot of storytelling, as we keep saying, that can and should occur along the whole length of the river. And this is one of the ways which we're looking to do supporting just that. So post-designation, there's promotion on the CHRS website, obviously with significant amount of traffic, both nationally and internationally. Annually, there's reporting that occurs on things like river-centric events, so dragon boat races in Edmonton, for example. There's been some discussion here at Smoky Lake County with our world-famous pumpkin festival that we should have giant pumpkin boat races or something of that nature. So I think that would be a really neat opportunity as well. And then every 10 years, a more in-depth study is done to ensure that the integrity values of the river are intact. And you know, if for example, I'm not aware actually of an example where designation has been rescinded, but that's a possibility, and there's certainly no penalties that come with that. So that's what kind of the every 10 years is for as well. Certainly, we've been having a lot of support from various communities and community groups across the province. Certainly, at this stage, 12 out of, I think something like 12 out of 16 river adjacent municipalities have provided a letter of support, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta, Treaty 6 Confederacy of First Nations, and various other groups as well. Certainly a lot of Edmonton folks as well. You'll see a lot of logos here. And that's really great. That tells us that we're on the right track, that this is something that Albertans do want to see happen. That brings us, though, to why we're here. And really our call of action is that hopefully during this presentation and the conversation to follow, that you've learned a little bit about the program. We want to get this right and do the most good possible with an initiative like this. So we're calling on each of the participants here to not only to complete our survey, but also share it with somebody who you think would also care to contribute their views. And maybe you think it's a dumb idea. Maybe you think that it's hugely problematic. And we want to hear from you too about that, as to why that would be. We've partnered with Wise Use to develop a survey. The senator was, before we logged onto the webinar, mentioning that she found it easiest to do the survey on a desktop, because we're asking some, I guess, open-ended questions about what the river kind of means to you. And so mindful of that, it doesn't take very long to complete, but it might be easier on a desktop format. We're going to have a What We Heard report published in May, and that's going to be shared with decision makers as well, so that they're kind of appraised as to what folks are prioritizing along the river as well. Boy, that was a lot of talking, Jordan. I think we've talked ourselves hoarse, and folks didn't actually come here to listen to us. So I think what we ought to do is talk a little bit more and introduce our panelists. And I'll turn it over to you to begin that, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Kyle. So thanks again to our distinguished guests on our panel today, Alberta Senator Paula Simons, Billie Milholland, and Thomas Long. And I will begin by introducing Senator Simons. So born and raised in Edmonton, Alberta, Senator Simons earned a BA in Honors in English Literature from the University of Alberta before moving on to complete her master's degree in journalism from Stanford University. In her past experience, she's been a radio documentary maker, a playwright, television pundit, magazine writer, a podcaster, and an author of public history, but is probably best known for her work as a political columnist and investigative journalist with the Edmonton Journal. Her investigative work on Indigenous child welfare and government cover-ups of the deaths of children in foster care also earned her recognition from the UNESCO Canadian Committee for World Press Freedom and from Journalists for Human Rights. She earned 6 further National Newspaper Award citations of merit for her columns and editorials on Alberta politics. And she's also received recognition from the Alberta Centre for Civil Liberties Research for her work championing the LGBTQ community and their rights. And I'll leave it at that, because I was told to actually keep it short. And I'll let Kyle introduce
Yes, we're also joined by Billie Milholland, who's a bit of a rock star in her own right. A writer and visual artist, Billie grew up in Elk Point, just east actually of Smoky Lake County, so she's kind of a neighbor. She began her career assisting with excavation at Fort George and Buckingham House, provincial historic site, and was immersed in the stories, interviewing the granddaughter of Chief Big Bear about her the memories of Frog Lake. She Began her career also with work with settlement-themed short stories, which were sold to CBC Radio. Later, she worked as an author, and she was instrumental in the mid-2000s, as we mentioned earlier, with completing the Heritage River background study while she was working for the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance, where she currently works as well, actually. She has then also written 2 other river-related books, the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance River Guide, which was a Edmonton Journal bestseller, and also Living in the Shed, which is a beautiful, vibrant, colorful look at the North Saskatchewan across Alberta. And I'd really encourage you to check out nswa.ca and check out her book. Really fantastic. Lastly, we're also joined by Tom Long, who's a certified interpretive guide and trainer and an alumni of Fort Edmonton Park, where he's worked for nearly 20 years. He's the co-founder and lead presenter of North Wind Heritage Consulting, delivering both interpretive training and historical presentations, and the creator of Yeg Tales, a series of Edmonton history webcomics. He swims, tubes, and canoes in the North Saskatchewan every year, and frequently exasperates his partner with endless fur trade tales, and that's a little bit relatable, unfortunately. I think we're both nerds. So, Tom, you had a short story that you wanted to tell. Would you like to set into that right now?
Yeah, that'd be wonderful if you don't mind. Thank you.
Excellent. I think I've empowered you to share your screen, but if you haven't, let me know.
I'm going to try it right now, and we'll see how it works. That should work. Okay. And just always the case. There we go. Does that look okay?
I think it does.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to try to keep this brief. It's a story that I like to call Mr. Rowan's River Race, and the year the North Saskatchewan was recognized as the crossroads of the continent. My point of view, of course, is that Kitsaskatchewani CP has always been a highway at home and an honored resource for diverse peoples. But I do want to, of course, start off by saying that I'm not an Indigenous person, and I'm going to be giving a non-Indigenous perspective on the fur trade, and even then just a tiny story within such a large and amazing topic. I want to start off with a bit of a context of the fur trade world. This is going to be set in the 1820s. So 1821 is when the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company finally merged after decades of often violent competition. And now the Hudson's Bay Company was supreme as the fur trading company in the West. But it's important to remember, again, even though I'm talking about the Hudson's Bay Company, and that's what we've traditionally honored in our heritage, that the vast population of the West was First Nations, and the Hudson's Bay Company and the fur traders were tolerated guests and not masters of all they surveyed. And the fur trade forts were largely run by Métis people. And the Métis are in the process of emerging in the 1820s, and their ethnogenesis, a high point was reached in 1816, but it continues especially in the West. So this is the setting in which we find our story set. Specifically, Edmonton was a small trading post, average sized on the North Saskatchewan River, and part of the Saskatchewan district, which stretched along the North Saskatchewan River. Slightly profitable and access to bison from the prairies, as well as fur from the parkland. The Northwestern Territory, specifically the Athabasca district, was the El Dorado of the fur trade and had the darkest and richest fur. And the Columbia district, here in this map called the Oregon Territory, was also a growing source of profit for the Hudson's Bay Company, and sort of jointly occupied at this point, as these things go. So John Rowan, one of my favorite subjects. If you're a visitor to Fort Edmonton, you've seen his big house. He spent most of his life in the West, and at this point in the 1820s is a chief trader in charge of the Edmonton and the Saskatchewan district. He started out in the Northwest Company, so he's got a lot of experience, but he's also married to a very important Métis woman, Louise Umferville, with a great deal of contacts, relations, and experience in the West. So John Rowan gets to draw on not only his own experience, but also that of his wife and other relatives. Dr. John McLaughlin, another character in the story, is a chief trader as well, later a chief factor, just like John Rowand, and he's being put in charge of the Columbia District on the other side of the Continental Divide. Its headquarters at Fort Vancouver, which is not our modern Vancouver, but at Vancouver, Washington, which you probably haven't heard of because it's right across the street from, right across the river from Portland. So I like to just say Fort Vancouver is basically Portland. And finally, the other player is George Simpson, and he is the newly appointed governor of the Hudson's Bay Company, and really just a terrible person, but interesting nonetheless. George Simpson meets with the Northern Council, all the chief factors, once a year, usually in York Factory, and they discuss the business of the trade before sending everybody on their way. And John Rowand and John McLaughlin are invited to the Northern Council, even though they're chief traders, which is one rank below chief factor. And so not quite the creme de la creme of the fur trade. Now, this year in 1824, 3 parties set out. It's not actually a race, but it's more exciting to think of it as a race. John Rowand is setting out to take charge of the Saskatchewan district again and leaves York Factory on Hudson's Bay on July 27th. Dr. McLaughlin leaves at the same time, but at Cumberland House, which is just where the northwest end of the Lake Winnipeg, where that sort of starts, he departs overland for the Churchill River, which is another route. And Sir George Simpson is departing via the same route. They're both heading for the Columbia District. George Simpson, however, leaves at least 2 weeks later. What happens next is in September, George Simpson overtakes John McLaughlin on this Churchill River route. George Simpson is well known for being a tireless driver of his men, who are actually tireless because he works them for 18 hours to canoe him around the west where he's governing all these different trading posts. He works them to the limit, and in fact, at one point he drove them so hard they picked him up and threw him in the river. He ended up forgiving them, and they ended up fishing him out as long as he promised not to prosecute them, because he could be a vindictive SOB as well. So Simpson didn't like McLaughlin very much, and they ended up being enemies later in their lives. So he was very pleased to overtake McLaughlin, even though he left 2 weeks after him with his accomplished canoemen. By October, so after several weeks over these portages, Simpson finally arrives at Fort Assiniboine on the Athabasca River. He's journeyed from the Saskatchewan River overland to the Churchill River, and then over several portages up to the Athabasca, and then up the stream, the Athabasca River, all the way to Fort Assiniboine. Arrives on October 2nd and finds that John Rowand has already been there and left. So the winner of this race is John Rowand, who took 52 days to get to Edmonton from Hudson's Bay, spent a couple of days unloading, then went overland to Fort Assiniboine, waited for 4 days, left a note for George Simpson, and then left. George Simpson makes it in 48 days, and again, he left 2 weeks later, but still he got to Fort Assiniboine last. And Dr. McLaughlin is our bronze medalist at 67 days to reach Fort Assiniboine. So what does this mean, and why is this race important? Because it re-recognizes the North Saskatchewan as the crossroads of the continent. Now that George Simpson has seen that somebody can get to the Fort Assiniboine and the Athabasca River Basin and the Arctic Basin via the North Saskatchewan way faster than you can over the old Methy portage, which just kills voyageurs as well. They all hated it. Edmonton becomes the crossroads of the West for the Hudson's Bay Company. If you're sending men or letters from York Factory to Fort Vancouver in the Columbia District, you no longer go via northern Saskatchewan. You go via Edmonton. So Edmonton is now the link, because from Edmonton you can go overland to Fort Assiniboine on the Athabasca. From Fort Assiniboine you go upriver to Jasper House, and then you can cross over the mountains and go down the river to Fort Vancouver. That means Edmonton is in the center and the linchpin of this continent-wide trading network. And it is linking three different watersheds, the Hudson's Bay watershed, the Arctic Ocean, and the Pacific Ocean, and they're all coming through the North Saskatchewan and Edmonton. So Edmonton becomes not just another post on the North Saskatchewan, but the premier post between Winnipeg and the West Coast. This is a fanciful painting, but I do like it because it shows Edmonton in its glory atop the banks of the North Saskatchewan, with York boats having replaced canoes for the most part, having brought goods not only to trade, but to send on to further in the Athabasca and the Columbia watersheds. I do want to acknowledge here again that I haven't touched on the economic world or the cultural world of the fur trade, which are all amazing. This is just one story of Mr. Rowan's river race and re-recognizing the North Saskatchewan and Edmonton as the crossroads of the continent. So I hope you'll conserve it, celebrate it, explore it, and maybe tube in it and swim it if you have a chance as well. So thank you very much, and special thanks to historian J.G. McGregor, from whom I learned this story.
Wow, that was a really engaging story. It's hard to imagine a world where we can't just hop in a vehicle and travel down the highway, and that our original highways were these rivers that you know, joined us together, and otherwise, you know, very, very hard going. It's hard to imagine, like as a recovering kayak guide, it's hard for me to imagine what it must have been like to try to navigate, and certainly, you know, would have been very difficult to do without local knowledge as well, from Indigenous communities who are already here.
Absolutely, yeah. George Simpson takes credit for the whole idea, by the way, even though it's John Rowan's who actually got there and like proved it. But at the same time, exactly as I say, John Rowan has all these Indigenous, Métis, and First Nations sources to draw on who knew this already. It was just, you know, finally recognizing what was what people had been telling them and what people had been using this river for thousands of years. And then using the strong backs of these, you know, voyageurs and tripmen too, right? I mean, John Rowan sat and smoked in those boats and read a book most of the time. Well, you know, these Métis tripmen are just over every portage carrying, you know, 180 pounds on their back. And when they're not doing that, they're rowing. And when they're not doing that, they're actually roped to these boats and canoes and like walking sometimes chest deep through water, hauling it upstream. The effort is just amazing. So there's a great quote recently that the past is great, but I wouldn't want to live there. And so Fort Edmonton Park is the great place where you get to visit the past, but you don't have to live there.
Absolutely. Visiting is just fine.
Yeah.
Senator or Billie, you both enjoy, you know, a deep emotional connection to the river, as I understand it. Do either of you have any comment that you'd like to make about, you know, how the river has influenced your lives, or how you see it as being continuing to be significant to Albertans today, just as it was decades and centuries ago?
Well, as you know, I have lots to say, but I would actually rather hear what Paula had to say right now, because a lot of people that are on this call can hear me just about any time, but we don't get much opportunity to hear what Paula has to say. And I know that that will enrich what I know already.
Well, thank you very much, Billie. I was going to defer to you because you're the expert on the river. I mean, I will say, for those who don't know me, I'm an independent senator representing Alberta in the Senate of Canada. I'm speaking to you tonight from Amiskatchewahagan, from Edmonton. And I'm also a member of the Senate Standing Committee on Energy, the Environment, and Natural Resources. So it's in part there that my interest in this project was engaged, because I serve on the Senate Environment Committee, and I had the opportunity to speak to Environment Minister Wilkinson about this project a couple of weeks ago. I think that we are at a really interesting moment in our relationship with the river. When I was growing up, the river was always seen, I think, as something sort of mysterious and dangerous and dirty. And it wasn't something that we engaged with. It was something that we looked at, we walked through the river valley perhaps, but the river itself was not something with which a lot of us had an intimate relationship. And I think there are two things that have really changed that. One, funnily enough, was the discovery of Accidental Beach a few years ago, which saw Edmontonians suddenly flocking en masse down to the river to wade and to swim and to watch their dogs swim up close. And I think for a lot of people, it was an epiphany. It was a realization that, you know, the water's pretty good and you can swim in this river and you can play in this river and you don't have to be scared of this river. And then I think the other thing that has happened is COVID-19. I have never spent as much time in the river valley as I have in the last 12 months. I think for people up and down the river, this is a realization that this is an extraordinary park space, an extraordinary wild space that we can all share. And I think what's exciting about this project is that it builds on the work of the 6 municipalities that are part of the River Valley Alliance, that are 3/4 of the way through their project of creating 100 kilometers of interconnecting trails that link all the way from Devon to Fort Saskatchewan. And so I think that, you know, this designation could be an important part of that. Now, I want it to be said, I think Kyle and Jordan have perhaps downplayed in some ways the environmental importance of this designation, because it is true that a Canadian national designation of the river doesn't put regulatory restrictions on it, but it does create a kind of a moral restriction, because in order to maintain that heritage river status, you have to maintain the sanctity of the river. That doesn't mean that we couldn't have cafes or water taxis. That's my favorite thing to think about, or, you know, canoe trips or glamping on Big Island. But it does mean that we would have more leverage to protect the river from industrial development and potential pollution, because we would be able to say, oh, no, but this is a heritage river. And it doesn't give it a legal status, but it gives it a symbolic status, which I think could be extremely important. We have 3 designated river strips in Alberta, in addition to the little bit of the North Saskatchewan River in Banff Park. We also have designated a little bit of the Athabasca and the Clearwater rivers within Jasper National Park. And I think it's time for us to say that this river doesn't end at the park gates. And it is integral to the history of the First Nations, of the Métis people, of the fur trade, but also of settlement. I mean, this, before the railroad, this was the way lots of settlers arrived here. It was an extraordinarily important waterway in the economic development of the city. And so what I think is absolutely essential, though, is that in order to be designated, you have to have broad community support. So far, the city of Edmonton is not at the table. The city of Edmonton has not joined in this effort. And I think it's really important for me as a senator not to get out ahead of the city of Edmonton, but I'm hopeful. I've seen people in the chat saying, you know, what can they do? I think if you live in Edmonton, you can approach your city councilors. You can try to see if you can get this on the agenda for the upcoming municipal election. And if you live in the communities outside of Edmonton, when we're all having municipal elections at the same time this year, if you live Riverside, this is something that you can go to people and say that this is important to you. Because before the province and the federal government agree to this, they have to see that municipal buy-in up and down the river. And now I want Billie to talk about the river. And if you haven't read Living in the Shed, it is just the most beautiful book. And I highly recommend it to everyone.
Thank you, Paula. I was thinking of so many things while I was listening to Tom talk about the highway and that wonderful race, and also thinking about when I was a kid and what I was learning about. We didn't learn a lot about the fur trade, but what we learned was so misleading. Things like Sir Alexander Mackenzie discovered the West Coast. So you had a vision as a kid of this big burly Scotsman tromping across from Hudson's Bay, tromping across 2 or 3 provinces all by himself. nobody mentioned that probably he couldn't have done it all by himself. He had to go with people who had been that route many times before. And it goes probably for all of the explorers that I learned about and my kids learned about. It was insinuating that somehow by their own superhuman powers, they managed to get from A to B. And getting from A to B on this river was simple. And of course it wasn't simple. And one of the first things that I learned that really broadened it for me was the journey of Anthony Henday, because when he came up this river and explored down into the southern Alberta and up again, he started out with probably 100 or so Cree people from York Factory. He didn't start off all by himself. The canoes that he traveled in were not built by him. They were built by the people he traveled with. He couldn't take enough food for a year away. The people he traveled with fed him. He would not have been smart enough to, he might have been able to, shoot the odd deer or rabbit or something. He probably wouldn't know how to cook it. And so, and knowing how he traveled with people and opened my eyes also when he got to southern Alberta and met with a group of Indigenous people from there. There were 300 teepees, 300, and they weren't small. The teepee that entertained him was large enough to seat 50 people. So these were people in charge of their life, in charge of where they went and what they did. And it's not a picture that we have much of. And one of the best stories on this river of Anthony Henday that I love is he finally gets back after a year gone and being looked after by hundreds of Indigenous people. They settled somewhere around Fort Saskatchewan, probably near the mouth of the Sturgeon River, because they have to build canoes to get back to York Factory. Well, you know that Anthony Henday's not building them himself. They camp for about a month there in April, I think part of March, part of April. And I don't know exactly how many canoes they built, because when they got to York Factory, they had 60, but they might have built 20 or 30 right there. But if you stop for a minute and think about that, these canoes were made out of birch bark. They were made from, they had spruce to form the frame and the spruce root to sew them up, the spruce sap to make them watertight. And it's easy enough to find. In fact, I talked to a original canoe builder several years ago to find out exactly what kind of birch trees did you need, how many did you need, how many spruce trees would you require for one canoe. It's pretty astonishing how much big forest was required for the building of that canoe. So think about Fort Saskatchewan right now. I don't know, there might be some birch trees somewhere. They're not the birch trees that would have been there then. And think about that was not the only time that they were building birch bark canoes there and other parts of the river. So knowing those kinds of things and knowing if 300 people were camping there for a month, they had to have wood to burn to cook their food. They had for every single day, and to warm themselves at night if it was cold. They had to have enough game out there to cook, to eat. So the land looked quite a bit different than it does today. We're sort of stuck with a early settlement notion of what this land looked like and what it could produce and how the early people lived. I had the feeling when I grew up that the early people lived in poverty, and they were so glad to have, I don't know, steel needles in copper pots from European people. And of course they weren't living in poverty. They had everything they needed. They had art, they had singing, they had dancing, they had full, complete cultures that so we've got a lot of catch up to do. And this river allows that, because every story along the river that we can hear about, if we broaden it to include the full story of who was there, it enriches all of us, but it also shows, and I think it gives opportunity for communities to find new ways to connect with each other when we explore those kind of stories. Like when we talk about David Thompson, and he spent a lot of time on this river. And of course, in the headwaters, he marched across the Howes Pass. But of course, he didn't do that by himself. Jocko Finley, a Métis guide, and his crew went up at the Howes Pass a year before that, and they made a path. They cut a little road for David Thompson, and they don't get mentioned, but you can imagine that every story, that little story that we have in some of our books and books for kids, is not the whole story. It's just a little scrap of the story. And when we talk about having a heritage river, it gives us the opportunity to enlarge these stories and make them wonderful, make them full of singing and dancing and eating and talking and gossiping and working and building, and not just this stiff old white guy walking across the land in his boots, because by then his boots would have worn out and he would have been wearing the footwear of the people who lived here, better footwear for what he was doing. And as we learn these things more recently, we don't have anywhere to put these stories. But when we have a heritage river designation, it begs for those stories, and they're there. They're not hard. I mean, Tom, you've probably got hundreds just under your arm, just waiting to come out. I've got hundreds. Other people have too. Just the story of the Métis Nation alone, the Métis people who were the river captains for the steamboats. Most of the steamboats were not driven by the white guys. They didn't understand the river. The river is very frivolous. Where the sandbanks are one year, they're going to be in a different place another year. You have to have people who have intimate relationship with the river to drive those steamboats, and we did. But that's not part of the story that we used to tell. And you see how I get going, and I just think of so many. And I'm excited about this opportunity, because it's not that we can't tell these stories without heritage designation, but the heritage designation, it kind of allows us a little crack in the firmament. And what I discovered from living in the shed, there's a lot of little bits of trivia, bits of historical trivia in there. And the feedback that we've got is that people really, really like that, and they're hungry for more. They would like more. And we get the feeling that people don't care too much about history. I believe what they don't care about is memorizing the prime ministers and memorizing the dates of the Plains of Abraham and things like that. There's nothing more that can bore a kid than to get them to memorize all of this stuff. But if they hear the stories told of how people traveled on this river up and down for hundreds of different reasons, and the exotic tourists that we had, like the 9th Earl of South Esk, he was sickly, so they said, go to Canada where you have fresh air. And
Billie, I did a whole hour-long documentary on the Earl of South Esk.
Did you?
I did. And
where is it?
Where is it?
Yeah.
I did it for the CBC. So I think it's still on their website, but this is years ago when I was still a journalist. So the Earl of South Esk was a Scottish nobleman whose wife died young, leaving him with a castle full of children, and he had a nervous breakdown. I mean, he went into a deep depression, and he left all the kids alone in the castle with I'm sure a phalanx of nannies, and proceeded to Rupert's Land for a rest cure. And he brought with him the complete works of Shakespeare, an India rubber bathtub, and proceeded all the way to the Rocky Mountains. He was the first celebrity tourist to come to Alberta. And he was a poet. He was a terrible poet. He was a terrible poet with a lot of money, which meant that he got people to publish his poetry.
That sounds like me minus the money.
Yeah, so he published his bad poetry, and he published it anonymously. And a reviewer who reviewed it excoriated the poetry and attributed it to a different other poet, said this is so bad, it must have been written by so-and-so. And the other poet, whose name escapes me right now, sued for defamation. Because how could anybody say that he had written such terrible poetry? So that's the Earl of South Esk. He was a terrible poet, but he was not a bad descriptive writer. And Mel Hurdig of blessed memory did a republication of the Earl's journals about his travels west. And I'm going to take the liberty of reading what he says about the river. Just a tiny little bit of what he says here about arriving at Fort Edmonton. This is August 11th, 1859. It was yet early in the day when we found ourselves looking down on the broad stream of the Saskatchewan River from the summit of a high, steep bank directly opposite Fort Edmonton. The fort, externally an oblong palisaded enclosure with flanking towers at the corners, at once struck me as being considerably larger than Fort Carleton. Immediately in front of the principal gateway, the ground fell suddenly in a deep and almost precipitous descent to the river, which at this point seemed to carry a great body of water with an apparent width of about 250 yards. Upstream, the view was exceedingly pretty, for the elevated banks which confined the channel were picturesquely broken and richly covered with an abundant growth of wood. From each side of the enclosures there dropped a sudden slope to level plateau near the riverside, the eastmost of which was under cultivation as an arable farm. They were cutting wheat at the time. A windmill placed upon the higher ground at the back of the fort betokened a certain amount of agricultural business in the district. And so, here we see the Earl and his bathtub and his complete works of Shakespeare. He noted the night before that he read Much Ado About Nothing while overlooking the North Saskatchewan River. So, there are stories from that era. There's stories like the story of Joseph Lewis, who was one of the first Black voyageurs to arrive here. He first arrived in Alberta in 1799 and ended up on several expeditions up and down the North Saskatchewan River, and was the first free Black man to cross the Continental Divide. So there are all kinds of stories we could tell. But I think the other thing that's important to think about, there was a move at one point to have the river valley where it went through Edmonton designated as a national park. And at the time, Mayor Stephen Mandel was not enthused about the idea of surrendering control of the riverfront to a national park. What heritage designation would give us is many of the benefits of being a national park without those restrictions or without ceding, our control of the territory. But it would allow us to market the river coherently, to explicate and interpret the history of the river coherently, to look at a river is such a wonderful metaphor for all of the currents that flow, whether it's, the impact of the river on Edmonton's history as a coal mining town, or Edmonton's history with its brickyards, or Edmonton's, using the water in all the different ways that early settlers used it for industrial purposes. So, we can tell so many of the stories of the First Nations, of the Métis, of the original fur traders, of the settlers, of, the later industrial history. And we can get smart about marketing this for ecotourism. We can get smart about marketing this as a way to celebrate the authentic history of this place at a time when, for example, our school curriculum may not provide our kids with that grounding in the history of their own place, their own territory, the history of, the importance of this river to all the people who call Treaty 6 territory home.
That's such a helpful comment, Senator. And we've kind of circled around this idea of experiential storytelling. And I think that's what's so phenomenally fantastic about Métis Crossing, for example, is that you get immersed in these stories that you are experiencing and not just hearing or watching, but doing. And so, for example, Métis Crossing is partnered with Victoria Settlement Provincial Historic Site for Paddle into the Past, where you embark on a 12-person voyageur canoe and spend some time out on the water and experiencing the river in a way that, the very first Europeans would have done, and also Métis and Indigenous people as well. And so that experiential opportunity, I think, is a huge piece of this, and I really appreciate the circling around on the ecotourism, because that's an area of massive growth as well. I mean, I don't know if anybody tried to purchase a watercraft of any kind last summer, but I expect that if you did, you would have found it very difficult because they were all sold out. And most likely that's going to continue to be the case. That's not a one-off, that's a trend. And so I want to get to one or two of the questions that have been coming into the question box as well, and we've answered a few of them. But the first of them is there any Indigenous representation on the Heritage Rivers Board? And I think the answer to that question is that certainly there's representation from Indigenous Affairs Canada, has a seat on that board, and as well. The designations in the territories work a little bit differently than here in the provinces, but the documentation requires basically that for a nomination to be successful, there needs to be meaningful consultation with Indigenous peoples, not as an afterthought, but early on. And so certainly the Métis Nation, President Audrey Petra was one of the very first supporters of this project way back in 2019 already. And so that, kind of helped get the ball rolling, and subsequently also Grand Chief Watchmaker of the Treaty 6 Confederacy has added his name to the growing chorus of folks who are wanting to see this move forward. And I'm really enthused about the stage we're at now, because it's important. But if we were to get into the next stage also, we can be looking at creative opportunities to see how this can perhaps contribute to developing new relationships. So municipalities haven't given a lot of thought in most cases, I think, to Indigenous relations. And I think this is a fantastic opportunity to promote that and to push that as well. Another question that has come in, and perhaps Billie, and we'll start with Senator as well, is you've kind of touched already on how can residents along the NSR advocate and support the heritage designation. So you've talked about contacting your local officials. Do you think that's the way to go? And I'll start with the Senator, who's muted.
My apologies. I went off to look for a link to my South That's documentary so that I could post it. Log rolling in our time, I guess we would call that. I mean, I think that the challenge here is to get Edmonton on board. And it's not for me as a senator to tell the city of Edmonton what they should do. And I think the city of Edmonton has some legitimate concerns. They want to make certain that that this is not going to be an unexpected cost to the city of Edmonton, or that the administrative responsibility is not going to fall to the city of Edmonton as the largest municipal partner potentially for this project. So, it's not my place to tell the city of Edmonton what to do, but it might be the place of those of you who live in Edmonton who might want to engage with your city councillor or with the mayor to suggest that this is a project that interests you. Certainly, I think it makes sense because it dovetails with everything the River Valley Alliance has been doing to build everything from footbridges to boat launches from Devon to Fort Saskatchewan. I mean, we've got so much environmentally friendly infrastructure in place to get people to touch the water, to get people, down to it. And we've got all of this tourist infrastructure, Fort Edmonton, the Valley Zoo, the Mattart Conservatory, Louise McKinney Park. We have the Royal Alberta Museum, which is not on the water, but explicates and curates so much of the history that is connected to the river. We have the funicular, about which I'm not a super funicular fan. We have people who are advocating for the gondola. I have strong feelings about the gondola, but these are, whatever I think about them, they are all elements of what could be a really extraordinary opportunity to celebrate everything that makes the river so spectacular and so special.
That's very helpful, I think. Billie?
Well, I concur. I think that Edmonton being the largest municipality, the most people, and I think that the city councilors, there are, I think, several city councilors who do think this is a good idea. I think that they need support, and we need to keep the conversation going. We need to bring it up. We need to, whether, depends on what your relationship is with your particular counselor, but pay attention to that. It doesn't hurt to send a phone call, to write a letter, because Edmonton will do nothing but benefit. The people of Edmonton will do nothing but benefit. They might just need a little poke, a little nudge to get them over the worry that they have. And of course, because we have municipal elections coming up in October, I think that city councillors who are going to still be running are very sensitive to, much more sensitive now to public opinion than they normally would be. And so it's the excellent time. We shouldn't waste it.
That's right. Yeah, it's been sort of hectic. There's so many layers when you're dealing with a designation that involves three levels of government, three partners of government, and then dozens of communities along the whole length of the river as well. So it's, I think, picking up steam and certainly a snowball effect, but it's really important that individuals also get out and are having these conversations both with each other and with their politicians as well. Because I think, as you point out, Billie, there's a lot of opportunity. Smoky Lake County is pursuing this for its opportunities. We're not seeking to cede jurisdiction or cause a kerfuffle where there oughtn't or needn't be one. So it's I think trending in the right direction, but a push from individuals and from organizations locally is still going to be necessary, I think, to get this accomplished. So that's why it's important that everybody who's here does fill out the survey, and then, but beyond that, share it with your friends and send a tweets to your politicians and etc. Another question here asks, will there be an opportunity for signage to be placed along the river to tell the story of the river? Or will this be strictly limited to the CHRS website? Having a good interest signs could aid in storytelling. And maybe, Tom, you, as an interpreter, you might have a perspective on that as far as providing signage and interpretation along the river.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I think web-based interpretation can only go so far, and it's a wonderful resource to have, but I certainly don't disagree. Having infrastructure and real signs in the place. One of the hallmarks of heritage interpretation is don't talk about something that you don't have in front of you. So you need that tangible benefit. And luckily, you're right in front of the North Saskatchewan right now, Kyle. So it helps us all when we're talking about it. But if you are going through the river and you find a sign, then it's speaking to what you are, where you are, and when you are, rather than later looking it up or needing a piece of technology to access it. The challenge, of course, is that infrastructure has a cost, and then figuring out what to say and how to say it and who should be involved in how to say it is its own challenge. But I think if we can achieve the heritage designation, then we've proven that we can build a big coordinated effort to do that. We can do the same thing for deciding on what stories to tell, who's telling them, and how we tell them.
I know that the River Valley Alliance is already working on QR codes to be sort of, you know, that you'd go up to the sign and scan it, and then you'd get all the information in your phone. Like Tom, I think it's a great idea, but there's something more tactile about actually standing and seeing the didactic plate that you don't have to do the QR code thing. But I guess I date myself.
Well, but not only to that point, Senator, I mean, that might be perfectly well and fine in some areas of the River Valley, but in a rural community, there might not be cell phone reception at the riverbank to pick up on something like that as well. So that's, I was just blown away on our poster, our invitation for the survey in this webinar. We had a QR code on there, and it was just, that was just a very fantastic thing, because I don't think Smoky Lake County has ever worked with QR code before. So it's a first time for everything. I want to, and I'm going to post it right in the chat right now. The Senator has provided a link to her work, her documentary. So
it's not the documentary. It's it's a more recent piece I did for 18 Bridges about the Earl of South Esk and his legacy. I'm not sure if, but it will give people a sense of, and of course the collection, all the Earl's stuff was repatriated by the Royal Alberta Museum, and you can see it. You can see it there, including artifacts that he purchased at Fort Edmonton.
Perfect. That's a perfect explanation. Thank you for that. There's also, and I'm going to lump two questions in together because I think they're kind of interrelated here, and I'm going to put it to Jordan perhaps to start. Is that the first question is: are there any perceived, and perceived is in parentheses or brackets, any perceived drawbacks to being designated CHRS? If so, what are the main concerns, and how can we resolve or mitigate them? And then the second question that I think could be interrelated is that specifically, how could a heritage river designation affect industrial use of the river? And so Jordan, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. And it's a great question. And I believe that you're correct that those are sort of two questions that sort of morph into one. From my perspective, I don't perceive any drawbacks to a potential designation. Certainly, anytime that you look at a designation of this nature, there's perceived conflicts of different user groups or interest groups, and obviously this type of designation may sound concerning to some people if they're not fully aware of exactly what it does and does not connotate. I believe Robert, I saw in the chat, had come in a little late, so I'm not sure if he saw our full presentation off the top, and where we explained that the designation is purely commemorative in nature. It doesn't pose any additional development restrictions. So in terms of how the heritage designation would affect industrial use of the river, it wouldn't impact it in any way. I had also mentioned during our presentation that I grew up pretty close to the Fraser River in BC. And if you've ever been there, you'll notice that there's development of all sorts there. There's a port, the Surrey port, right on the Fraser River itself. And that hasn't been compromised by the designation at all. So, you know, I don't really see any perceived drawbacks. And in fact, I see the opportunities that we've all been discussing here tonight, opportunities to you know, teach people through the stories about our history, not just from, you know, the Eurocentric perspectives that we typically get in our textbooks, but also talking about all the Indigenous stories and the voices that have been silenced over the years. Looking at the environmental aspect, as Senator Simons had indicated, perhaps Kyle and myself had been a bit remiss to not include a little bit more about the environmental you know, protection and stewardship components of a designation of this nature. So, you know, I guess if you don't like those types of things, like protecting the environment and encouraging, you know, local stewardship and storytelling and communities and meeting new people. I guess that would be a drawback, but I see this as a purely positive type of a designation. But certainly, if anybody else has any comments that maybe I've missed something, maybe there are some drawbacks, certainly be happy to hear them.
I think if I can add to that, Jordan, something that we've been hearing, and maybe you'll agree or maybe you won't, is that there's a hesitation, and this is kind of in the bones of being an Albertan. There's a hesitation that as soon as there's anything federal, it's some sort of a plot, a machination of sorts. And so I think that's a barrier that we've encountered, and we've been trying to lay out how in the different ways this is driven locally for local purposes by local people, and that's, that shouldn't necessarily have to be an anxiety, I guess. So I think that's one thing that we have been overcoming and continue to need to. Again, we're a rural municipality, right? We're a small rural municipality that's been pushing this forward. And so I think we've been making some good progress in terms of laying out the reasons why this is an opportunity as opposed to a challenge. Certainly, in our consultations to date, we've been reaching out to different industrial associations and briefing them on the context of the program and how, actually something that I learned that just blew me away actually is that the water quality and the environment of the North Saskatchewan has been improving dramatically in the last 20 years. We have a healthier river today than we did 20 years ago. And I think that's something to be celebrated. So, I mean, when we're thinking of those Alberta decline reports on heritage rivers, those were done at a very different time. And I think if they were to be redone, the North Saskatchewan would rank even higher as far as natural values go, because water quality has improved so substantially. That has a lot to do with individuals. So since the province of Alberta brought in Water for Life strategy in the early 2000s, individuals and communities have gone leaps and bounds faster in terms of stewardship than I think the government was even prepared for. And so now it's the government actually that's catching up with the people in terms of watershed stewardship and the like. And so I think it's generally a good news opportunity. And I think things like the Ribbon of Green with the City of Edmonton, one of their planning documents, Ribbon of Green, they're working on revisiting and bringing into modern standards right now, actually. So I think that's the primary consideration that pops up. And then once we've gone through all the facts and explained how this is an opportunity, one of the municipal councillors, and I won't name them or where they're from, they said, "I can't believe this hasn't been done already." And so we agree. So that's what we're continuing to work towards.
I think it's actually really important that the leadership on this is coming from a bedrock community like Smoky Lake, so that that somebody can't say, "Oh, this is something that Justin is making us do this to our river." Trust me, as an independent, non-liberal senator, it is difficult for me to explain that to people. There's a certain constituency that thinks that there's a whiff of brimstone about anything that has to do with federal trespass. But in point of fact, navigable waterways are governed by federal environmental regulation. And so, I spent a lot of time 2 years ago working on Bill C-69, which was the new Environmental Impact Assessment Act, and major changes to the North Saskatchewan River will always be federally regulated. And so there is a role for the federal government. There is a legitimate role for the federal government. And this would be the nicest possible way for the federal government to say, yes, we celebrate the stewardship of this river. And I think if this initiative were being led by Edmonton rather than Smoky Lake, I think people might be more hesitant. So I think it's actually fantastic that Smoky Lake has been the one to be driving this.
I tend to agree with those comments. I think that's really very helpful and accurate. There's a question as to when you're reaching out to a councillor or an elected official of any kind, what do you ask for? And so what I would suggest is that you can state your support, that you think that this is a good idea, and ask whether the councillor would be willing to introduce a notice of motion to ask for a report to be brought forward to a future council meeting in the near future, hopefully. That would be really helpful to get it onto the City of Edmonton's agenda. Of course, I don't know, we've been working for some time to make that happen. So I think we're getting there, but yeah, a notice of motion would be really helpful to make sure that this is treated as a priority and that Edmonton doesn't get left behind, because they're an important partner potentially as well. I also wanted to note, and I think it escaped somewhere here in the comments, because when additional comments come in, things get lost. Let me just see. Can we start a River Valley book club led by Billie, please? Billie and Paula, sorry. I would be the first to sign up, number one. But I'll just plant that there. I'll plant the seed there for now.
I'm not sure, at least from my point of view, that that people would want to wade through some of the crazy stuff that I like to read. I mean, Paula was talking about the 9th Earl of South Esk. Well, this is the original copy of his book.
Whoa.
And I've got lots of these, and they're old and they're musty, and they're and I like reading all of it. And I like the idea of a book club, but I'm not sure that every person would want to go this far. Maybe we could find a more medium place to go.
There's a lot of variety as far as river literature goes, and I happen to be one of the ones that like old musty books, so that's not dissuading me, but I hear what you're saying. Ladies and gentlemen, it's 8:30. I've really enjoyed this conversation, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I noticed that attendees have kind of started to drop off, and we're already kind of a little bit over what I kind of envisioned we would do, but this has been such a wonderful conversation. And I think we've answered a couple of questions. I'm not seeing any that we've necessarily missed, and if we have, I apologize. I'll be reviewing the material here, and if we've missed anything, I'll reach out to the attendees and try to answer anything that we have missed. But I want to really, truly thank our panelists, Billie Milholland, Senator Paula Simons, and Thomas Long, for giving us part of their evenings and their wisdom and their stories. We've been lucky to have them join us this evening, and hopefully they'll each continue to be seized of the project, and you know, each of the attendees, I'll mention again, I will be forwarding out the survey once again. You can find that on our website, smokylakecounty.ab.ca. And yeah, I guess this is a lot of talking to try to wind us up, but I guess I'll do a round of closing thoughts if you'll endorse us for just one more minute. I'll start with Jordan.
Thanks, Kyle. And I'd just like to echo what Kyle said. A wonderful opportunity for us to have a great conversation here tonight. I've learned a lot. I'm even more excited about this project than I was a couple hours ago. So thank you to our distinguished panel for your insights and your expertise in this area. And I'm glad that you had the opportunity to speak with us tonight. Thank you to everyone who participated via the questions in the Zoom, and just those of you who were here just to listen. We appreciate it. And I'll pass it on maybe to Senator Simons.
Well, again, I just want to thank Smoky Lake for taking the leadership role here. I want to thank Tom and Billie, who are such fabulous historians and storytellers. And I just want to say that, you know, when Kyle was showing us his screen a little earlier, he had a picture of the house, the Parliament buildings in Ottawa, and you could see a water taxi. And I would just like to say that I fantasize about a water taxi that goes from, you know, from the zoo to Fort Edmonton and the John Jansen Nature Center, to the legislature building, to Louise McKinney Park, over to the Matart Conservatory, maybe, you know, to Gold Bar or Rundle Park. I think that it's a psychological thing. For so long, we turned our back on the river and we looked over it. We walked through it, but we didn't get on it. And I think that we need to embrace the river and embrace the fact that we are all river cities.
Thank you for that, Senator. Billie, any closing thoughts?
I agree 100%. When all you have to do is take a person who's never been on the river, even for 15 minutes in a one of those paddle boards or a canoe or a rubber raft with River Watch or something, and the awe that comes over people when they realize that they're in the middle of a big city. But once you're on the river and you see the pelicans over here and there's a coyote running over there and there's a quietness to it, and you don't have to leave the city to get that, but it's very impactful. And we don't have a lot of ways to get regular everyday people onto the river. There's, people pay big money to take a bit of a river, I don't know, a one-day cruise or whatever it is they do. But I would like a river taxi would allow most people to go for 15 minutes, a half an hour, or from one thing to another. And once people got familiar with what that felt like, I don't think they could resist it.
I tend to agree. Thanks for that, Billie. Tom.
So well said, both of you. So thank you very much. It's such an honor to be here and to be a part of this panel. There's so many things that run through my mind because the river is just so inspiring, and I miss it so much right now. But so the voyageurs I was talking about earlier, the trip men who worked for the Hudson's Bay Company, who were mostly Métis and Scots and Canadians, they had a real esprit de corps depending on the routes and the areas they were in. So the brigade that went up the Métis Portage and that Churchill River route were called Les Poissons Blancs, the whitefish. And the brigade from Red River, what's now Winnipeg, were the Les Taureaux, the bulls. And the Saskatchewan brigade called themselves the Breros, or Les Blaireaux, or badgers. And so I think there's a really amazing sense of community after learning that, I think of with all the communities along the North Saskatchewan, that we're all badgers, we're all Breros. And it defeats me why no city has actually named their sports team the Badgers or the Breros, because, we've got enough. I love oil, but we have plenty of energy themed names. So the Breros would be part of it. But I think it says something that I hope we can take to heart about this and other causes for our river, is that badgers are tough and tenacious. They don't give up, and they attack with ferocity. And don't attack with ferocity, be polite, but don't give up either.
Oh my goodness, that's going to stick in my mind. That's a very helpful metaphor and example. I think for myself, the program is a unique opportunity in that it weds a few different pieces, being cultural, natural, and recreational. Not everybody cares at the end of the day about biology and naturology, so to speak. Just in the same way as some folks are not engaged by culture, but by packaging each of these three things together, there's an opportunity to reach a greater crowd of people and to provide educational, interpretive opportunities, and then to package it as heritage. Because prior to coming here to Smoky Lake County, I hadn't necessarily conceptualized of nature as being a heritage worthy consideration. And I think the fact that this sort of program brings all of those things under kind of one umbrella is a huge opportunity for stewardship, for tourism, to make money. I mean, at the end of the day, if you can package stewardship as a money-making exercise, are you kidding me? Like that's the stuff of a politician's dream. So of course you can get support at that level. So I could talk on and on and on, and I think all four of us could, but we will call it there. I cannot thank each of you enough. I know we've gone obscenely over time, and probably none of these panelists will ever speak with me again, but I appreciate it very much. If anybody has any questions following out of tonight, send us an email, give us a call, and have very safe travels, and we'll speak to you again soon.
Thank you, everyone.